They didn't scream, not at first. The frost in the air bit down harder than any blade, and the restraints were tight. Metal cuffs embedded in brick walls inside a freezing windowless cell. Naked, starving, slowly dying. The guards watched through narrow slits, scribbling notes as the hours passed. The prisoner, a man in his 30s, shivered uncontrollably. His lips turned blue, his breath slowed. But not once did anyone enter the room. Because this wasn't a prison. This was a laboratory. Unit 731 didn't exist on any official maps. Hidden in the hills of Manchuria, near the outskirts of Harbin, this secret compound had no name, no sign, and no laws. To outsiders, it was simply the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. But inside, it was something else entirely. A human testing ground. The invasion began in 1931, when Japan staged the Mukden incident, a false flag explosion on a railway line, giving them the pretext to storm Manchuria. It took days to overrun the region. Chinese forces were scattered. Towns fell without resistance. But in the shadows of that occupation, a darker operation took root. General Shiro Ishii, a doctor-turned-military man obsessed with bacteriological warfare, saw Manchuria not just as conquered land, but as an opportunity, away from prying eyes, a place where rules didn't apply, where human lives could be reduced to variables in an experiment. The facility grew fast: barracks, labs, dissection rooms, crematoriums, and holding cells, dozens of them. Thousands of civilians, resistance fighters, Russian POWs, Korean peasants, Mongolians, and even children were abducted without trial. They were given a new title by the doctors: logs, like wood, something to be used, burned, forgotten. Inside the compound, horror had a method. Prisoners were assigned numbers, stripped of names, forced to kneel in the snow for hours while their limbs were soaked with water and left exposed. The goal was to study frostbite. Technicians watched until skin turned glassy and black. Then came the hammer. If the sound of the blow echoed like wood, the limb was frozen solid. They would then saw it off, without anesthesia, and try reattaching it, or transplant it onto another prisoner just to observe rejection. One man, still conscious, was forced to witness his own legs removed, swapped with those of another victim, then sewn back together at mismatched joints. He bled to death. Another was exposed to repeated freezing and thawing, dozens of times, until the flesh peeled off in layers. Vivisection was routine. Healthy prisoners were injected with typhus, anthrax, or plague bacteria. Then, while still alive, they were cut open on cold steel tables, no sedatives, no restraints beyond leather straps. The surgeons, dressed in rubber aprons, dissected organs as they failed, hearts slowing, lungs choking on fluid. Eyelids fluttered. Some tried to speak. Most just stared. Women were raped by guards to produce pregnancies, then dissected to observe fetal development. Babies were removed alive, then frozen or drowned. Some were placed in high-pressure chambers to simulate altitudes, their veins bursting. Others were tied down and sprayed with flamethrowers just to measure burn depth across layers of tissue. Prisoners were locked in gas chambers and exposed to mustard gas and phosgene while researchers watched through glass, skin blistered and lungs filled with blood. In other tests, prisoners were spun in centrifuges until they lost consciousness, or injected with seawater to test if it could substitute for saline. It couldn't. They tested grenades by tying prisoners to stakes and tossing explosives at different distances, measuring wound radii. Flamethrowers were aimed at naked bodies from 10 feet away. Some were infected, shot, and then left untreated so doctors could examine natural disease progression under battlefield wounds. In one compound, a mother and her child were frozen side by side, then slowly thawed, 1 degree at a time, to compare resistance across age. Some victims were sewn together, shared arteries spliced between bodies, just to see how long they'd survive. Organs were removed, swapped, stitched shut again. A woman had her stomach taken out and her esophagus directly connected to her intestines. She lived for 3 days. These weren't isolated horrors. They were organized, structured, data was charted, observations logged. Unit 731 became the largest and most advanced biological warfare facility in the world. They bred rats by the thousands to raise plague-infested fleas, which were loaded into ceramic bombs and dropped over Chinese villages. Infected cities were sealed off. No warning, no aid. Entire populations died in weeks. The scientists weren't madmen. They were educated, polite. Many had medical degrees from Tokyo, Kyoto, even German universities. They smiled in photos, posed with colleagues, played music in the evenings. Then, the next morning, they returned to the labs, pulled another prisoner from a cage, and opened them up. The logs never fought back. Most couldn't. They were too weak, too confused. Many didn't even know why they'd been taken. Some tried to appeal to humanity. One Russian woman offered to work as a nurse, sobbing as they strapped her to the table. Another man asked to write a letter home. He was granted a pencil, then shot minutes later. The Harbin townspeople lived in quiet dread. They saw trains arrive in the night, covered in tarps. They heard faint screams on still winter mornings. Some risked leaving food outside the gates. Others simply looked away. Soldiers patrolled constantly. A single question could lead to arrest, and no one came back. By 1942, Unit 731 expanded across Asia. Satellite facilities appeared in Singapore, Bangkok, and Nanjing. Hundreds more victims. The data was used to plan larger-scale attacks, including a proposed plague bombing of the U.S. West Coast. It never came to pass, but the intent was real. As the Allies advanced in 1945 and the Soviets swept through Manchuria, the order came: erase everything. Files burned, buildings demolished, thousands of prisoners executed. Some doctors poisoned survivors to prevent them from talking. Others fled back to Japan under false names. When Soviet troops arrived, they found remnants, rusted tools, charred documents, frozen limbs discarded behind sheds. They conducted trials in Khabarovsk, exposing the crimes. But in Tokyo, things played out differently. The U.S. struck a deal. American intelligence, desperate for biological warfare data, offered immunity to Ishii and his staff in exchange for their research. No trials, no charges. The doctors returned to civilian life. Some worked in government health programs. Others joined pharmaceutical companies. General Ishii lived quietly in Tokyo and died in 1959, never facing a courtroom. The victims had no such peace. An estimated 3,000 to 12,000 people died inside Unit 731. Civilians, prisoners of war, children. Their names were lost. Their families never knew what became of them. Their bodies were incinerated or buried in mass graves beneath fields where weeds now grow. For decades, Japan denied the existence of Unit 731. Only in recent years has the truth begun to surface, thanks to testimony from survivors, leaked documents, and the tireless efforts of historians. But no one was ever held accountable. No reparations were paid. The legacy of Unit 731 lives on in silence, in textbooks that don't mention it, in memorials that don't exist, in a world that still debates whether knowledge gained through torture should ever be used. Some of the data from Unit 731 may still be in circulation today, in labs, in textbooks, in governments. It's a reminder that beneath every medical advance lies a question: at what cost? And in the snowy fields outside Harbin, the wind still howls over what used to be the compound. The buildings are gone, the doctors are dead, but the ghosts remain, thousands of them. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.